I once tried to add up how long we had lived in the post-Cold War, post-ideological combat utopia that came upon us in 1989, put an end to the long nuclear and ideological standoff under which I and many of you had grown up, appeared to inaugurate an era bodied forth principally by Frank Fukuyama, in which liberalism and democracy and pluralism and a version of the market economy would be not just the regnant, but in effect the only model for societies. There was talk of a peace dividend, if you recall. I'm sure someone must have said swords and plowshares, though I don't actually remember it. Of turning our attention to the sufferings of our brothers and sisters in Africa, particularly, long neglected or subordinated to what appeared during that epoch to be larger concerns. Anyway, some of you will remember that euphoria. I calculated that if you date its beginning from an episode that I witnessed, which was the overthrow of the Nicolae Ceausescu regime in Romania between Christmas and New Year of 1989. If you date that as the end of one-man rule and one-party rule in Europe, then a period of euphoria and the new utopia lasted for about 111 days, after which Slobodan Milosevic invaded Bosnia and attempted to annex it to a greater Serbia. And Saddam Hussein did not invade Kuwait, as is often said, but annexed the state of Kuwait, an independent state, a member of the United Nations, of the non-aligned movement, of the Arab League, of the Conference of Islamic Governments, annexed it to be the 19th province of Iraq, at a time when we now know he had the choice of either developing his bomb before invading Kuwait or invading Kuwait and then getting additional financing for the bomb that he had underway. We didn't know it, but we were living in the hollow of his hand. We were also living at the pleasure of people like Slobodan Milosevic. While all this was going on, coming up on the inside track, as it might be said, in Afghanistan, and barely noticed by us, was a fusion of the idea of the one-man rule and the one-party rule with the one-God rule that makes this dictatorship even more iron and inflexible and menacing, because, like the others, it leads to failure, state failure, and like the other state failures, it will not blame itself for its failure, but will export this violence and blame conspiracies of others for its own collapse. And for me, the special symbol of that also took place in 1989, when the theocratic head of a foreign state who just lost a war with Saddam Hussein, the Ayatollah Khomeini, offered money in his own name for the purpose of the suborning of murder of a writer of fiction living in London who was not an Iranian citizen, a friend of mine by chance named Salman Rushdie. A very radical challenge, I thought, to every possible value that's represented by the Western Enlightenment into a free expression. Therefore, it seems to me that the kind of muscle and sinew that people are going to need to have acquired to combat the new form of totalitarianism is the sort that some of us gradually, rather randomly and haphazardly, but gradually did acquire in realizing that the recrudescence of ethnic fascism in Europe had to be stopped, realizing that Saddam Hussein could not be allowed to get away with the destruction of another country, and that in the long run the existence of his regime, or the coexistence with it, perhaps I should say, was impossible and undesirable for the United States and for the rest of the civilized world. To realize that the challenge from Islamism was mounting and becoming more and more bold and promiscuous, and being mounted much more in the streets and squares of our own societies. V-Day, the fatwa promulgated in London and Paris and New York against Salman Rushdie, and that this was the kind of, as I say, fiber one, now I look back on it, perhaps had to acquire to realize what was meant by the horror of the challenge of September the 11th. And it's nice to be in a room for once where people don't mind using the word war, even if elegantly shaded and nuanced, as by Bill, because where most of the time I have to spend my life is in places where people have been war-weary since the late afternoon of Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001. Now, I don't think anyone has quite conveyed, I'm going to have a shot at it. What was the quality of that shock? Look, if you've been in Sarajevo, as I've been, if you've seen something of the Kuwait War and the war in northern Iraq and Kurdistan and so forth, I had done some of that by then. Frankly, the sight of seeing someone jumping in flames from a building isn't all that terrifying. The fact that it happens in America, I think, is narcissistic distress. That kind of thing happens in a war, has to be expected. If you're in a war, you're going to lose a building and a plane and maybe a small town and a schoolroom. You should reckon about once every week. Get ready for it. That wasn't the shock to me. The shock to me was this. The president went missing for a whole day and crept back to Washington and made a craven speech written by Karen Hughes that he should have retracted by now. That we were left under open skies by NORAD. That we were betrayed by our intelligence agencies, the CIA and the FBI, who hadn't bothered to realize that incubated in our own society was the deadliest of enemies. That these enemies were further incubated by two state systems, that of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, who we had been educated by our elite to consider as friends, as moderates. A gigantic betrayal on a historic and colossal scale, accompanied by the most appalling impotence. I can't forget how helpless the country felt that day and how abandoned it was, and I never shall. And I don't think anyone ought to be able to or be allowed to. All of you, I'm sure, read Mr. Woodward's book on, or two books on the origins of the war and the consequences of it, where he relies very heavily on Mr. George Tenet of the Central Intelligence Agency. I'll make this my encapsulating anecdote, if you like. You can always tell who's helped Bob Woodward, because if you're described as the aspirant, tough-minded son of hard-scrabble Greek immigrants, you're one of his sources. That's the case with George Tenet in this case, and there are other reasons why he gets good treatment and why his quotations are put in quotation marks, quite a rare privilege from Woodwardiana. Well, we know what the first remark made by the director of our Central Intelligence was in the immediate post-9/11 epoch, the first few seconds of it actually, because we know what he said when the men ran in to tell him, Mr. Director, you better leave this meeting with Senator Boren. And it wasn't because he was late for his next one, and he had to watch on the television what had happened. And his first remark made by our intelligence establishment in this era we're now in, was the following. Gee, said Mr. Tenet, I hope it's nothing to do with those guys in the flight schools in the Midwest. Okay. Does this man deserve a Medal of Freedom, do you think, on his retirement? Should he not rather have been impeached? Should he not have at least been dismissed? Should he not, in fact, probably have been prosecuted for criminal negligence? No, because it must not be admitted. And therefore, it's left for us to face the fact that this is an army fight that's going to need volunteers. We cannot, in fact, delegate this to our leaders or complain when they get it wrong. It's going to call upon us. And the moment I want to reach is when in the Arab press you start to read worried articles saying, do you realize that our extremist policies of terrorism and so on are creating huge forces of resistance in the West? We've really driven them now to a point where they're ready to fight. People all over the United States are signing up, saying, what can I do? How can I push back against jihad? Now look what we've done with our intervention in their internal affairs. That's when I'll know that we've turned this round. And do you feel, any of you, any sign of any of this mentality or self-respect or dignity in our society? I don't. But that's what I think we have to learn how to fight for. And we know who the enemy is. I'm not going to waste much time on that. The vile combination in Islam of self-righteousness and self-hatred and self-pity. It's Trinity that we see every day. It's wrong for the president, it was wrong then for him to call it an attack on America, to say that we were either with us, the Americans, or with the terrorists. There were 80 nations represented in those towers that day, several hundred of my fellow countrymen among them. I refused to go to a ceremony, especially for people of English descent, because I didn't want to go to anyone's national or ethnic celebration. It was an attack on civilization itself, as should be very plain. And we should be very careful, I'm sorry, sir, to correct you slightly, of saying we have not been attacked since, because if we take that stand of civilization, we have been attacked almost every single day since then. Either in the form of our servicemen and women in Afghanistan and Iraq, whose performance I think is beyond praise, or the attack on the the resort of Bali in Indonesia, attack on holidaymakers there, the regular attacks on Jewish institutions and places of worship, ancient synagogues in Tunisia, in Turkey, in Morocco, all of these countries with governments that opposed the interventions in Afghanistan and in Iraq, by the way. The attempt to blow up the London Underground, facility used by many Americans every day, if you care to put it like that. And in my opinion, most of all, and touched on, I was glad to see by Bill, the attempt in the fall of 2001, very underreported in our press, to blow up with a huge series of truck bombs the Parliament of India, the Lok Sabha in New Delhi, that represents, if you ever go and look at it in all its splendor, the true parliamentary consummation of a genuine multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious democracy based like ours on the rule of law, the English language, regular elections and the free market are, in my opinion, I submit, future closest ally and a country with which we have a great duty of solidarity. Every now and then, if you're like me and you go on the air and you debate with some whining, self-righteous, self-hating, self-pitying Muslim, and you tell him what you think of his Quran and his Prophet, and so he says, you have offended 1 billion Muslims. You notice this? You notice that? There's a slight tone of moral blackmail here, I sometimes think. Look, if it was a matter of defending the right of somebody to hold their religious opinion, I would defend the right of a Muslim if there were only 3 of them. The idea of 1 billion is clearly intended as a threat. There's a menace to that. You've upset 1 billion of us. You should watch out. That's what it means. And we're going to try and move in to your city and your country too, and we're going to raise more and more demands. That's what's meant by it. But what about 1 billion Hindus? What about 1 billion Hindus who've been declared anathema, who have been declared fit for slaughter at any time, at any place? They're not even monotheist. Look what happened, for example, to the Nepalese guest workers in Iraq. Did anybody see that unbearable video of the mass slaughter and throat cutting of these Hindus? You have to see it to believe it, and the commentary that goes with it too. And India is not just Hindu. There are more Muslims living in India, in a democracy, in a serious multicultural society, than live in Pakistan. We shouldn't despair. We have allies who've proved themselves ready to fight. Now, I mustn't trespass on the time I've decided to borrow from the extreme terseness of my 2 comrades here, but I just wanted to say that those of us who thought it would change everything were obviously wrong. For most of our countrymen, it has not done anything of the kind. They want reassurance. They even take part in opinion polls saying, I want a politician who makes me feel safer. Can anything be more contemptible than this exercise? And we suffer like the sugar in the kidneys of a diabetic, as Rebecca West called the moral atmosphere of the Chamberlain government, from 2 very widespread illusions. First, that we ourselves are the cause of terrorism. Senator Harry Reid, I give you, I don't pick at random some extremist like Michael Moore or Ramsey Clark, the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate, says that yes, it's true that Al-Qaeda is in Iraq. The only time on which, now it's obviously there and has gone to all the trouble of calling itself Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, it's no longer denied that it's there, you notice. But it's only there because we are there, says the Senate. He said it in a reply to a presidential broadcast. It was not an ill-considered or off-the-cuff remark. A prepared statement. Yes, Al-Qaeda's forces are in Iraq, but they are only there because of us. Defeat in the mind, surrender, capitulation, as well as a completely false statement of the case. As we well know, Mr. Zarqawi and many of his associates were in Iraq long before the first coalition soldiers set foot there. Or an alternative argument made recently by Maureen Dowd in the New York Times, that the problem is that we are in occupation of what she called Muslim land, denominating territory by religion, clearing the ground on the New York Times op-ed page for the caliphate to come. Well, this is a pretty dire state of moral surrender as well. Or we're told that if only we could drop the Jewish state off the back of the sled, they'd leave us alone. Sometimes this is phrased as that Israel-Palestine is the crucial question of the solution, etc., etc. Well, everyone should know and probably does in this room, but I'll say it briefly. Al-Qaeda is an outfit that begins in Asia, not in the Middle East. It starts with trying to develop, by tearing out the territory of the Philippines, an independent Muslim state in the Philippine archipelago. It goes on to demand the return of East Timor, which was nearly destroyed as a people by Indonesian occupation, to Muslim Indonesia. It blew up Sergio Vieira de Mello, the great Brazilian UN envoy in Baghdad. It murdered him on his first week on duty in revenge, as stated by al-Qaeda, for his role in overseeing the independence of East Timor and the election that brought it to self-government. It wants to wrench Kashmir away from the Indian Union with the help of Pakistani subversion. If that was allowed to happen, the resulting bloodbath in the subcontinent would dwarf, absolutely dwarf, what we remember of the bloodletting of the partition of 1947-48, and would wreck and destroy the other great multicultural democracy and ally of ours in the world. It's quite a lot of concessions, in other words, that we're going to be asked to make in order to appease these people and to make sure they don't harbour any more evil thoughts against us. And in my opinion, half of Palestine won't quite satisfy them. And in my other opinion, which I'll share with you, nobody blows themselves up in a Jewish old people's home on Passover in Netanya on the Mediterranean coast of Israel proper, not in a settlement, not against the wall, not in an occupied territory. Nobody does that in order to bring about a compromise. It's just an instinct I have. I have the feeling that they won't be happy until there are no more Jews in what used to be Mandate Palestine. That's certainly what they say they want. I'm in favor of taking the enemy seriously to that extent. And on this question of let's not provoke, and that we're the cause of their reaction, let us just examine this for one more second. All it takes in order to get the diplomatic immunity of a small northern European democracy violated, its diplomats shot at, its embassies burned by crowds in the capital cities of countries that do not normally allow demonstrations, its trade ruined, its economy sabotaged, its nationals and the nationals of other Scandinavian countries threatened and killed randomly around the world. All that it takes is the refusal of the elected Prime Minister of Denmark to agree, weighted upon as he was by a delegation of 20 Arab ambassadors, to break his own country's law and tell an afternoon newspaper in Copenhagen that it couldn't publish certain cartoons. That's all it takes to bring about jihadism now. That's the threshold of provocation. Now you have to be, I think, a real masochist to say, well then we must avoid doing this kind of thing. Because all they're asking is that we change everything that makes our way of life different from theirs. And then it's true, I suppose, there would be very little to fight about. But in the meanwhile, I think that we have to face the fact that it's a clash of civilization, of course, and about civilization, and within a civilization. It does represent also, I think it's nice to be able to note, a war within Islam too, where we don't know how lucky we are that fighting on our side are forces of the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan and of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan in Iraq, whose emblem I'm proud to wear in my lapel. People who are fighting against Saddam for us and taking heavy casualties when we thought his regime was a matter of indifference. And these people are just as Muslim and have just as good a right to claim that they observe that faith as do anyone else. We should never forget our duty of solidarity to them, and they are our brothers and sisters in arms. And with the other victims of bin Ladenism and this horrifying cult of death and murder and suicide that says that it loves itself and its cult more than we love life. Much depends then, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades, friends, much depends on the multiple ways in which we can disprove that assertion and assert the power of life and pluralism over the morbid, sordid and medieval enemy that we're now faced with. Thank you.